I'd like to give you some feedback. That the way they're going to experience it is like a wild bear running at them, but they can't express it. So all that fear and terror is going on inside of them, right? And people are going to shut down. That kind of flight or fight response gets triggered.
Welcome to You Might Try This, a podcast about learning how to lead without losing yourself along the way. Hosted by executive coaches Stacey, Philpot, and Cade, Cowan. This show draws on 25 years of experience working with high-level leaders and brings those lessons down to earth. If you're navigating leadership for the first time, managing people, questioning old rules, and trying to build a career that actually feels good, you're in the right place. This is You Might Try This, honest leadership advice for ambitious people who still want to sleep at night.
These first episodes are dealing with some of the most fundamental challenges that we see leaders facing today. And the one we're tackling today is the one that, in my experience, most leaders avoid like the plague, which is, of course, giving feedback.
You know, Stacey, I've observed competent CEOs even who will go through the effort of basically reorganizing a company in order to move a poor performer to a new role so that they don't have to go through that arduous task of giving the person the feedback that they really ought to be hearing.
It's true. And what an expensive way to give feedback or avoid giving feedback, right? My goodness.
Seriously, right? It's a big problem.
It is a problem. So today we're going to talk about what are some of the psychological reasons people are unable to give clear, constructive, and helpful feedback.
Yes, we're going to talk about what doesn't work. And we're also going to look at some of the psychological reasons that people avoid giving bad news in general.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think, why are they so afraid when they hear the words, I want to give you feedback? It strikes terror in our hearts. So we're talking about that too.
Amazing. The science is amazing on that.
It is. All right, so let's get started. Cade, you have done a lot of research into what we've been taught traditionally around how to give feedback. What have you learned?
So one of the things that I just find interesting is just how out of date some of the advice that we've been given is. So, for example, a lot of people who are listening have probably been taught what you and I at one point were taught, and that was to give the compliment sandwich, right? The idea that if we give a positive and then the negative, and then another positive when we give feedback, that's the way of, proceeding. And It's actually been kind of a standard in management advice for decades. I mean, from what I understand, it emerged in the 1940s. So it's now like 75 years old and the world has fundamentally changed.
Yeah, there's not a lot that I think we still do in business from the 1940s and hold it up as a best practice, right? So let's just say that might be a little out of date, right? Completely. Where did it come from? Like I know, like I said, you did research into this. Where did that come from?
So from what I understand, the feedback sandwich was actually popularized by Mary Kay Ash, who founded Mary Kay Cosmetics. Now, listen, if anybody listening sells Mary Kay, this is no discredit to you. I do not want a pink Cadillac driving by my house and opening up the spray.
Honking and screaming.
Yeah, these folks they're serious about it. So Mary Kay famously said, you sandwich every bit of criticism between layers of praise. And for her, you know what, like so much, this was well-intended. The idea was that the sandwich approach was a way to build self-esteem. So you started with the positive. And by starting with the positive, you signaled that you valued the employee. And the idea was this initial praise would kind of open up the listener so they'd be more receptive to then the negative feedback.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it sounds logical, but in my experience, what happens is people, it can actually break trust because they tend to kind of dismiss that first part and they're listening for the, let's call it the poop in the middle, right? A feedback sandwich can be called like a shit sandwich. And they're like just listening like, okay, you're telling me these good things, but what do you really think? And they kind of overvalue that negative criticism and dismiss the positive. So,
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And the reason this feedback sandwich fails, It's pretty interesting. You can relate it to the idea of, in journalism, this burying the lead. You put the most important part of the story in the third or the fourth paragraph. We know that's cardinal sin inside of journalism. Also, though, in storytelling, and it's kind of this, you're telling a story of the person's performance. So when you wrap the critique, the real message that needs to be heard in layers of fluff, people feel like you're kind of burying the lead.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I think also some people tend to think about feedback as the content that you're giving, but I find that feedback is a way to actually enhance trust in a relationship. And if you're giving a positive, a negative, and a positive, sometimes people don't know what they're bracing themselves for. And they're afraid that they're being manipulated by the positive, that somehow the negative is the true feedback and that you're not being as honest with them by putting the positive first, right?
That's right. I mean, if you've ever had that experience of receiving the sandwich, you're seeing the smiling face of the compliment, but there's a threat underneath that. It's what I've heard it called vicious politeness. To your point, not only does it break trust, but it gets in the way of what you wanted to do in the first place as the manager, which was to help the person develop. But if they can't hear the content of what you're saying, because again, it's sandwiched between what could just be somewhat superfluous praise. We're not really giving that much thought to the praise, are we? We just really are worried about that central message. So if they're not hearing the praise, then it just all gets muddled. You think you're being the good guy, right? Or you're being kind, but you're actually just being ineffective.
You're making me think of like seeing a shark fin at the top of the water and there's like a shark underneath and like the Jaws theme is like playing da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, yeah, and people are nervous. And, you're raising another thing, which I think is that most of us like to think that if we don't give bad news, we're doing it to protect the other person. But you've pointed out a couple things to make me realize, again, I think most of the time when we don't want to give bad news, it's because we're trying to protect ourselves. And so that makes it kind of a selfish activity,
Isn't that interesting? And so often when we frame things without even realizing it, we're framing it as, I just don't want to hurt their feelings. It is because of our own need. And therefore it is kind of an act of selfishness, as hard as that might be to consider. As humans, we sometimes think that our badness is transmissible or contagious. And there's this idea that social psychologists use this, they call this a fear of moral contagion, the idea that the badness is transmissible. And so we fear that if I'm the one to tell you that your performance is failing, I'm somehow bad in your eyes. Your failure somehow sticking to me. So our fear of being bad,
interesting,
as the feedback provider is so strong that we'll actually sacrifice the opportunities to tell people how they could improve, how they could be more effective. And we do that just to protect our own image.
Well, what's interesting is because when that happens, and I've personally experienced it, the feedback comes out as very vague and confusing, right? And so now you've gotten a signal, well, somebody wants to tell me something, but I don't really understand exactly what they're saying. So now I'm actually anxious because I know something's important, but I don't know what it is.
Yes, there's something going on here. I know what people are, there's something going on here. So the other person obviously knows, like, the weather in the room has changed. And I've heard people talk about that before. As the leader, you're responsible for the weather. And if you are creating this ambiguous situation where there's a message that clearly ought to be given that you're somehow squelching, then clearly the other person can sense that the weather in the room's changed. The manager's staying pleasant, though. And so there's really no data to act on. So what happens is that person's just kind of like left in this hyper-vigilant state. They're wondering, where are the landmines? I'm tripping over something, but I don't know where it is. And, we know that hypervigilance tends to kill creativity, tends to kill, thinking differently. It just squelches people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. People talk a lot about psychological safety. And ironically, getting kind of vague feedback makes people feel unsafe, sometimes even more in the long run, I think, than immediately hearing some negative feedback, right?
And it's back to that whole Brene Brown line that we've used before, like clear is kind, unclear is unkind. When we're muddling the message, we're being unclear and unkind. Again, it's coming back to you as the manager. It's your own selfishness that's oftentimes standing in the way of the message being delivered.
Okay, so there are a lot of good reasons, right? We can see it in the science that managers are afraid of giving critical feedback. And, it seems to me there's some reality to it, right? There's also, for some people, when you give critical feedback, the other person gets defensive, and that's a really negative experience. Like if you've ever had to give somebody tough feedback and they kind of freak out and get upset or get defensive, it does not feel good. It is a tough thing to go through, right? So, giving feedback, there's a reason I think people fear it sometimes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we know that the science has now shown that people get defensive because hearing negative feedback is actually painful for people. When the whole fMRI technology came out so that we could do interesting brain scans, there's so much that we learned about brain science and what parts of the brain lit up during certain experiences. And a researcher, Naomi Eisenberg, I think I'm getting that right. I always say Eisenberg, UCLA, forgive me. She led a study in 2003 and she actually made the point. So they used these fMRI scans and they found that the part of the brain that processes physical pain, it's part of the cortex, anterior cingulate cortex. That sounds so smart, Stacey. That's the part of the brain that lights up when you receive negative feedback. It's also the part of the brain that lights up when you stump your toe.
Wow. So it's like physical pain. The same part of your brain lights up when you get negative feedback or physical pain.
Correct.
Wow. That is amazing, because that's kind of like, hey, I'm disappointed in this report is the equivalent of being physically injured. Right. Correct. You're telling me it's like processed with the same sort of neural urgency, if you will. Right. Well, I think I actually didn't know about that study, but I have talked with clients sometimes about, you need to know that when you say the words to someone, I'd like to give you some feedback, that the way they're going to experience it is like a wild bear running at them, but they can't express it. So all that fear and terror is going on inside of them. Right. And people are going to shut down. That kind of flight or fight response gets triggered. And you're saying there's actual neuroscience behind that.
Yeah, there's actual neuroscience. Again, processed as pain. So when you say to someone, I want to give you feedback, the person hearing that is experiencing it as if you're about to hurt them. And think about it. We've all gone into performance evaluations. That's not fun. We're not excited about that conversation. We're wondering what blow is about to land.
Yeah, it's like, how much time do you spend preparing, going, okay, do I know how they're going to criticize me or what's missing? Because that feels like I have some control, or I'm prepared, or I'm ready, right? That's important. Well, I think it's interesting because when people experience fear, right, it shuts down your brain, right? They call it cognitive narrowing, right? Like you have a survival mechanism in your brain where when, you're in a state of fear or discomfort, right? You focus only on a few things so that you can protect yourself, right? And you're really focused on the threat, which means that if, I'm afraid, because you've now said the magic words, I want to give you some feedback, I'm really only looking for threats. Right. And you can see it sometimes, like in the physical signs, like people will kind of literally, like their eyes will narrow, they'll look down at a piece of paper on their desk, they're nodding, but they look a little checked out, because literally physically that's what's happening. Right. They kind of see that bear coming and they're like only looking for the threat right in front of them.
So think about it. You've got basically both the manager and the employee who really dislikes this conversation. The manager, because we've said there's this fear of moral contagion, the idea of me giving you bad feedback somehow reflects poorly on me. And then you've got the employee who's in survival mode. So they're both not happy about this.
It's kind of amazing that any of these conversations actually happen from that point of view, right? Because we're all so busy. We have a meeting that both people don't want to have. The likelihood that gets moved on the calendar is pretty high, right?
Yes.
Okay, so here's the question.
How to do it, right?
Correct. So how do we help leaders deliver the truth without triggering that pain reflex in people, or that getting that cognitive narrowing where they're shutting down? How do we help them hold up a mirror without it like feeling like a hammer for people?
Yes. Well, one of the things that we can think about is this idea of understanding. There's this concept called the looking glass self, and it comes from a sociologist, Charles Cooley. And basically he said, and this is heavy, but he said, our sense of self isn't really built from the inside out. We'd like to imagine that it is. I'd like to think that I am that, wholesome as an individual, that I've built my own identity. But he says essentially that's not the case, that our sense of self is built from the outside in. His quote was, you got to follow this one: I am not what I think I am, and I am not what you think I am. I am what I think you think I am. We got to process that one for a minute. Does that make sense, Stacey?
Well, my sense of identity comes from how I believe others perceive me.
That's exactly right. It's
Got
this
it.
looking glass, right? Who I believe I am is who I think you think I am.
Well, from that perspective, think about how heavy a feedback conversation is. It's evidence about how others perceive me. And that gets right into my core sense of identity. So of course it's threatening. Of course it's scary. It's not just that the data is negative and it hits a pain receptor, right? It's you're touching on something that impacts my sense of identity and self and who I think I am.
So that really ups the ante inside of a feedback conversation. Now, what we want to do on one hand is give people tools and concepts to allow them to get through it. But I feel like we could be scaring them a little bit.
Everyone's like, I'm not ever giving feedback again. It's actually worse than I thought. No more.
Yeah, right?
Okay, so let's not do that. So what are the things? Okay, so let us
Well,
talk
so you just got to think about it, right? So if you've got to be very mindful of your own biases and how you're perceiving that person's behavior, because they are, again, going to construct their sense of identity through how they believe you are seeing them. So as a result, we've got to be as careful as we can be, as objective as we can be when we're actually giving the feedback. Yes?
Yes, got it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one of the things that, I think is important for us to understand is how often leaders inaccurately interpret behavior. So there was this book, Person in the Situation, written by a person named Lee Ross. And essentially in the book, they noted that as humans, we tend to misinterpret why people do what they do. We know this, right? He explained, and this is kind of fundamental attribution error, which we've talked about. He basically said that we have this tilted habit where when I fail, I blame the situation. So I didn't have time, didn't have the resources, yada, yada, yada. However, if you fail, I blame your character. She's lazy, she's unprofessional, she doesn't really care about the work. So I say you're being unreliable. So again, fundamental attribution error, which we've discussed before.
So I love that, because what you're pointing out is that it's actually a part of human psychology that makes we make meaning, right? We don't just see things as they are and we think we're objective. And so what that means is, as a manager, I am there's a pull for me to give you feedback about your character or make a character judgment. Like if I'm not paying attention or I'm not being disciplined, I am accidentally going to give you feedback on your character.
Exactly. If I'm not disciplined, to your point, I'm going to ignore what could be your possible context, and I'm going to go straight to character. So when we do that, it signals to the other person that they're in danger, right? I have assailed your character, your sense of who you are. And so, of course, this whole fight or flight, that cognitive narrowing, which you mentioned, it kicks in. Their sense of self-worth is going to be triggered. So when they start looking for reasons why you are actually wrong about them, it becomes an argument.
That's right. Because from their perspective, they're not unreliable. Their workload was off the charts, or they want you to understand why they were under so much pressure. And now you're having a debate over cause versus actually looking at the feedback and getting into it and helping the person learn?
So this is where our first bit of like what, you might try this. So one thing that I really like is this idea of an adjective ban. Be really helpful. It's a discipline that a leader has to instill. But basically, you can't describe the performance issue without using an adjective. You're not really ready to have the conversation.
Interesting.
So basically, you're sloppy. That's an adjective, right? Unprofessional. That's an adjective. No, you got to go back to what is the behavior that you might be interpreting as unprofessional, but that again is going to trigger that fight or flight. That is, you're assailing the person's character with an adjective. You got to stick to the objective, rational behavior, not the adjective. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And you're helping me understand why one of the frameworks I give leaders to help them with the conversation is the model of situation, behavior, impact, or SBI. And so the idea is I tell them when you want to give someone feedback, you need to be able to say three things. First, you need to think about what was the situation, what was the behavior you observed, and what impact did it have? So using your example, Cade, it would be like, hey, last week when the report was due on Wednesday, and I hadn't received it by Thursday morning, and I had to follow up. And you told me it wouldn't be ready until Friday, right? That was the behavior, right? The situation was last week, this report, the behavior was you didn't give me the report on time, and I asked you about it. The impact it had on me was I didn't have what I needed for a meeting, and I was also concerned about whether you'd be willing to meet deadlines in the future, and I could trust you.
Excellent.
Okay. Now I've not described who you are, your identity. I'm not touching your identity, but I'm talking about what happened, right? And it kind of forces you to have to give the feedback in a specific way.
And the real discipline there is to make sure that the B and the SBI does stay with behavior, because that's where people can slip into the adjective. Situation is, I needed that report on Wednesday. Turns out you were really unprofessional and got it to me late. Like that's where it slipped in, right? It's
like in couples therapy or family therapy when they're like, you need to use I statements, and you're like, oh, okay. Let me be clear. I think you suck, right? Like that's not an I statement.
Well, never mind.
So don't go there.
One more thing about feedback. Which I think builds on SBI really nicely. So much feedback is like postmortem. It's after the fact. It's about something in the past that can't be changed. That's where I love bringing in kind of the Marshall Goldsmith concept of feed forward. So he talks about this distinction, which is how we view our roles. He says that feedback is essentially a judge. So you're a judge looking at the crime scene, an autopsy, so to speak. So you're kind of asking like, why did you do this? Feed forward, which he contrasts with feedback, is less about being a judge, more about kind of being an architect, looking at the blueprint, if you will, more future oriented. So rather than saying an autopsy of this late report, you shift the conversation into the next one, which is, hey, the next time we need to produce this report, how can we ensure the data is ready, validated, 24 hours early and on my desk? So you're kind of trading off this look back of something that's happened that you can't actually do anything about to now some opportunities, something much more active, something with more possibility inside of the future.
I mean, what I like about that is you're actually giving people a path forward and helping them understand how they can improve and do something differently, right? Because the thing about the past is they can't change it, right? And so you're using what happened in the past to correct behavior and direct it positively forward. And I don't think that is how most people give feedback, but it's a lot more useful. I love the kind of that feed forward approach.
Yeah. And one of the ways you might think about it is, your job as the manager giving the feedback isn't to be like the smartest person in the room who caught the error, but the person that helps ensure that the error doesn't happen twice. And think about the balance of that conversation. If you're someone who's normally hesitant about giving feedback, can you get through the SBI part, the looking back, in like 20% of the conversation, and then spend 80% of the time architecting how it can be avoided in the future? You can imagine how the person's going to feel differently as a result of that type of conversation as opposed to one that's just muddied and circles the drain as you continue to stumble on attempting to give feedback.
Right. And you're like assailing their character and they're like, stop, don't, I'm being attacked by a bear. Right.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Yeah. So, much better.
In the spirit of the name of our podcast, you might try this. As always, 3 experiments that you might try in the coming week. And first, from me, this idea of the adjective ban, I think it's such an effective little tool. So the next time that you've got to address a performance issue, strip away the adjectives, the labels. So, the word unreliable, slow, unprofessional, like just stick to the behavior. So the adjective ban, hold up that mirror and see if they can't see the reflection for themselves. Much easier for them to see the reflection if it is observable behavior and not character.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Well, and I think to support the adjective ban, giving feedback in the SBI model. So describing the situation, the behavior, and the impact it had. Hey, when you didn't get me that report when you said you would, right, for last week, that impacted me and that I wasn't ready for a meeting and it was difficult for me. Providing feedback with SBI, I think, is another thing people can try.
And then lastly, I often say to leaders, when I hear them complaining about their team, I often remind leaders that their people are, in fact, a mirror for them as well. Like your people reflect your leadership. And so I think one thing to consider doing is to simply ask your direct report, like, what's one thing I'm doing or not doing that's making it harder for you to hit your headlines? Like, take some responsibility there. Their performance is a reflection of your leadership. And so it's an opportunity for you to learn what you might do differently. So I think that would be the third one for me.
Well, Cade, I'm just going to add on to one thing you said there, which is when people ask for feedback, the fight or flight response doesn't get activated, right? You're not coming at them. And so what I love about that is you're also modeling for people the idea of ask for feedback, because it's so much easier to ask for feedback than for someone to have to give it to you. And, that's where trust gets built, right? By having those honest conversations, not just in praising people, but both having clarity and being open and feeling like you can get through it together.
Yes. And I guess we should just leave by saying these are often difficult, but we've said many times, discomfort tends to be a sign of growth. And so if you're uncomfortable inside of these, can you think about it as this is a path to growth for me?
I love that. Very well said.
All right. This has been a fun one. Stacey, thanks for being here.
Love it.
See you next time.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to You Might Try This, brought to you by EDC and Edgewise Media. To learn more about the podcast, visit youmightTryThis.com or connect with us on social media.